Hey Beaklings, today we're going to start our discussion about photosynthesis. So depending on where we're at in class, you probably just got finished doing cellular respiration. That's very important, okay? So the way I teach this class, the Bio 1 Honors, is that respiration comes first. So you really should have gone through that chapter so that you understand redox reactions very well, electron transport, chemiosmosis, things like that, okay? All right, here we go. You can see I start here with these beautiful flowers, even though the main point of this chapter is really the leaves, not the flowers. But I love this plant. This is called foxglove digitalis. This is witch's bells to some people, they call it, because there's some toxic chemicals in there. Actually, we use it in some heart medication, but it can kill you, too much of these flower petals here. So pretty crazy. Plants are pretty amazing, and they do some miraculous things that you'll see this unit. So as you can see here, it's the equation from last chapter, okay, cellular respiration, only flip-flopped, right? Last chapter we had oxygen coming in and glucose coming in, right? And we were a furnace, and what we did was we oxidized that glucose, okay, which created CO2, and the electrons that we took from the glucose went on to oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain to form water. So we oxidized glucose so we could reduce oxygen. And what was the whole point? Well, we lost a lot of energy as heat, but we got some ATP. This chapter, we're actually mixing together carbon dioxide and water, okay, and we don't actually mix them. Basically what you're doing is water goes into a plant, you oxidize it, take the electrons from here, okay, and you excite them. You make a low energy electron a high energy electron. How do you do that? Well, via sunlight, okay. And where do you put these electrons? Well, you reduce carbon dioxide, okay, or an intermediate thereof, and that creates your sugar. When you split your water to steal the electrons, oxygen is released. So it's very similar to last chapter, just little differences here and there. So let's continue. All right, some backgrounds. Information here. Autotrophs are, of course, the producers of the biosphere. So plants are self-feeders, or autotrophs, because they convert light into chemical energy stored in sugar and other organic compounds. Okay, and if you're going to make your own food, or if you are an autotroph or an autotrophic organism, you're almost always using sunlight to do that. Okay, but there are some chemotrophs out there. Plants are producers as well because they supply food for nearly all of Earth's organisms, right? Even if you're not eating plants, which you should be, okay, but what you're eating directly relied on plants, and those plants directly rely on the sun, right? So very important. There are other photoautotrophs, right? Organisms that use light energy to make their own food as well. Okay, and here you can see large alga plant and cyanobacteria, so photosynthesizing bacteria, pretty cool. Okay, so I told you last chapter that it's very important to know where you're at all times, and that goes again for this chapter. If you understand where you're at in a leaf and where you're at inside of a chloroplast, it makes everything just much easier to understand. So the green parts of plants have chloroplasts, okay, that contain the light-absorbing pigment chlorophyll. All right, so plants have lots of different plastids sometimes, but in this case we're talking about the main guy, chloroplasts, right? And the main pigment, chlorophyll. But of course there's lots of other pigments in plants as well. So chloroplasts are concentrated in the leaf's interior tissue, the mesophyll. All right, so you can see here you're inside of a leaf, okay, and inside you have this whole big spongy area here, okay, and there's a lot of air in there, okay, it's not too dense. And what's going on here is this is called the mesophyll, and inside of the mesophyll you have these mesophyll cells, and inside of the mesophyll cells you can see there are, in this case, chloroplasts, and then we'll talk about what all these structures are in the chloroplast. The stomata of the leaf, okay, they allow gas exchange. CO2 can enter and O2 can come out. And these are tiny little molecules, so they simply diffuse, okay, in and out, no big problem. You can close these, which we'll talk about later. There are guard cells here, which will allow the stomata to open and close, okay. Water is, of course, soaked in by the roots and travels to the leaves via veins. All right, I do see some people water their plants and they're squirting water all over the leaves and things like that, which I guess it's fine, I don't know. But point is, they don't use that water, they use the water from the ground, right? They suck it up through their roots and all of their root hairs that are down there. And just like mitochondria, chloroplasts have a fluid inside their inner membrane. So here you can see you actually have three major membranes, which we'll talk about, but where it's talking about right now is not outside or not inside of this one, but inside of this one. Okay, so you have this outer membrane and an inner membrane. So inside of this second membrane right here, you have a lot of fluid, okay, and that's called stroma, and that's where sugars are going to be made. And how do we make these sugars? Well, CO2 and H2O, right? They're the reactants of photosynthesis. Add a little sunlight in there and we are good to go. Concentrated stacks of thylakoids are called grana. Okay, so here you can see a granum, or these are grana stacks in here, these green big discs, okay, all stacked up. So the one green disc is called a thylakoid, okay, and it's called the thylakoid membrane is the actual disc itself, right? So grana is just basically a stack of thylakoids. Comprende, here we go. Chloroplast is to what as what is to cellular respiration. All right, so chloroplast is obviously an organelle and cellular respiration is a process. So chloroplast would be to photosynthesis, right? As mitochondria are to cellular respiration, or a mitochondrion. All righty, so there's a little bit of the introductory anatomy of a chloroplast. Okay, so plants actually produce O2 gas by splitting water. A lot of people think that plants take in CO2, do something with that molecule, and release the O2 from it, right? And that's not true. This is actually going to become our sugar. The O2 that plants give off, okay, that becomes part of the atmosphere that we breathe in for cellular respiration, well, that actually came from water. And how do scientists figure this out? Well, radioactive isotopes. Photosynthesis is, of course, a redox process as a cellular respiration. Okay, and here you can see the main difference. Water is oxidized, CO2 is reduced this chapter. This is an endergonic reaction as light energizes the electrons up a staircase. Right? So this is pretty cool because you can actually get into some pretty high-level conversations here about entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, because what you did last chapter was you took this beautiful C6H12O6 carbohydrate, right, this perfect little monosaccharide, and you shredded it, and you released a ton of heat. Yeah, you got 30 plus ATP, but yeah, you kind of increased disorder and entropy. Well, in this case, look what a plant does. He's putting the energy back in thanks to sunlight. So he's going to take this electromagnetic energy from the sun and he's going to put that energy back into a molecule, and he's actually going to make glucose from our waste products, right? The CO2 in the water. Having said that, it's not completely fighting entropy though, right? Because any time that you transform or transfer energy, you will lose some as heat. So even though plants are kind of trying to undo what we did last chapter via cellular respiration, by them taking in these lower energy products, adding sunlight and creating these beautiful sugars for us, okay, and giving off the O2, they actually did lose some heat energy as well. So entropy still increases. Bummer. Okay, so photosynthesis occurs in two stages linked by ATP and NADPH. Yeah, that's right. Notice last chapter we had NADH and FAD. Okay, or FADH2. So this time we just have NADPH. So it's almost the same thing. It's just a little electron carrier. And the way I like to tell students to remember it is just see the P there. P is for photosynthesis. So instead of NADH, okay, being the reduced form of an electron carrier, now you have NADPH carrying those two high energy electrons. So the first stage of photosynthesis is what we call the light reactions. Some people say the light dependent reactions. And the second is the Calvin cycle. Okay, so as you can see, we're inside of a chloroplast here, and this is a pretty good picture. There's going to be an even better one coming up of this, but it's a nice simple picture for you to understand what's happening here. So in the light reactions, it occurs in the thylakoids, right, along those membranes that we talked about, the green solar disks. Light energy is going to be absorbed, so photons from the sun come down here, okay, and they the energy gets absorbed by chlorophyll molecules, and what's happening here is we're going to oxidize water, okay, and take the electrons. That releases the O2 from water. Now, what did we do with these electrons? Well, we're going to steal them as NADPH. We also are going to pump some hydrogen just like last time, and we're going to have an ATP synthase in there, and we're going to make some ATP. Now, what was the whole point of the light reactions? Well, it's really to power the Calvin cycle. Now this occurs not inside the green disk, but inside those two membranes like I showed you before. The Calvin cycle is happening in the stroma here, and here's where you invest your ATP and your NADPH. So thank you, sunlight. Okay, because now we're going to invest these things into CO2. Okay, and again, we're going to have a guy sitting here named ribulose biphosphate, RUBP. So he's going to end and start the cycle kind of like oxaloacetate did last chapter. Okay, but he's going to sit here, and when CO2 comes in, it's going to get fixed inside this molecule, and whammo, we're going to feed it the energy that we made during the light reactions, and that's going to allow us to produce sugar. Pretty cool. And if you notice here, look at this, NADP plus, okay, and ADP and inorganic phosphate are ready to go again and get filled right back up. Pretty neat. Okay, so here's Melvin Calvin. He and some colleagues, Andrew Benson for sure, used the radioactive isotope carbon-14 to find that the carbon of CO2 was used to synthesize sugar. And this is a big deal because, again, a lot of people thought plants took in CO2 and they did something, but they released that O2 as oxygen gas. And now we know, no, that's from water actually. And the reason we found out that CO2 can stay in the plant, okay, and become the sugar is because of radioactivity, right? These radioactive isotopes that acted as tracers. So the incorporation of carbon from CO2 into organic molecules is called carbon fixation. So very smart guy, actually. My organic chemistry professor in college actually knew him and knew Melvin Calvin at Berkeley, which is pretty cool. So comprende, even though the Calvin cycle requires no light, why do most plants go through it during the day? Well, think about it. Even though you don't directly need light, right? When I was in high school, we used to talk about the Calvin cycle being the dark reactions. That's probably a bad thing to say, right? Because it doesn't need sunlight directly, but calling it the dark reactions makes you think like, oh, the sun has nothing to do with it, and that's not true. So why would a plant still go through this during the day? Think about the products of the light reactions, right? To power this cycle, you need the ATP and the NADPH from the light reactions. Right? So even the Calvin cycle doesn't directly need light, it certainly independently or indirectly does need light. Okay? All right, here we go. About to get a little physicsy on you here. So what is this energy that we're talking about coming from the sun? Well, it's visible radiation is what drives the light reactions. So sunlight is an energy known as radiation. We've all heard that, or maybe you haven't heard of electromagnetic energy. Electromagnetic energy travels in waves, okay? And these wavelengths, if they're very short, they have very high energy, and if they're longer, they have less energy, okay? And the very short ones can actually damage organic molecules, okay? And as you can see on the chart here, take a look at the size. So when they're super, super tiny, oh boy, very dangerous, like gamma rays coming out of the sun. Or there's some medical equipment that can use like a gamma ray, like the gamma knife to actually cut, right? Very, very fine, excellent cuts. So these are very dangerous. Of course, you know about X-rays and UV, very dangerous. But as you go out in this direction, well, you're getting pelted with radio waves right now. They're not going to hurt you, right? But where we're really talking about in this chapter with photosynthesis is that plants can harness this energy right here, okay? And at this point in this electromagnetic spectrum, we call this visible light, okay? And this is the radiation our eyes see as color. So the reason that you're able to see all the colors of the rainbow is because of the different wavelengths of this visible light. And this is the type of energy that a plant can absorb at its pigments. Okay? So the colors you see are actually wavelengths that are reflected, not absorbed. So if we were in class right now together, I'd probably pick out somebody wearing like an orange shirt or something like that. And I would say, all right, class, why do you see this orange shirt right here? And what I would like you all to say is like, okay, probably some sort of fluorescent lights above our head, right? The light is hitting that shirt and it's absorbing the energy. It's absorbing these wavelengths of light. So why do we see orange? Well, orange is the one that is bouncing back to our eyes. And your eye knows what the different wavelengths are, unless you have a disease where you can't differentiate between certain colors, okay? So orange hits our eyeball then, and we say, okay, I see orange right now, okay? And it's the same principle as you probably know if you've ever gone to the beach on a really hot summer day, okay? While you're walking to the beach on the hot sand and things like that, you know that that sand is hot, right? If you don't have sandals on and things, that's that energy coming from the sun. But the only energy we're talking about right now is the visible light, okay, for photosynthesis. But think about if you had a black shirt on, Okay, black is actually the absence of light or the absence of these colors, meaning you're absorbing all that energy and you're going to get very hot, right? That black should feel hot. Whereas if you have a white t-shirt on, okay, well, white is actually the presence of all colors. So if you mixed Roy G. Biv together and saw them all at once, you're just going to see white light, okay? So that's why if you're at the beach and you're wearing a white t-shirt on a really hot day, it should feel a little cooler to the touch. All right, pretty neat. So, my goodness, the sun is 93 million miles away, and the solar radiation is still too strong for us to safely look at it without protection, right? So there was a total solar eclipse a few years ago, as from when I recorded this video, and wow, yeah, there's some idiot there wearing 3, or did I have 4 on? I don't know. Polarized lenses, and it was okay. I was able to look, but that took like 3 or 4 sets of really good polarized sunglasses for me to be able to do that, and it's very dangerous. You should never look directly at the sun. All right. So chloroplasts have different pigments that absorb different wavelengths. All right. One family of yellow-orange pigments called carotenoids may collect energy, but they also help the chloroplast from getting damaged by very bright lights. And your eyes have protective carotenoids as well, which is pretty neat. And obviously, you know, the green one absorbs different colors of light, and as you can see here in this diagram, what color do you know is definitely not being absorbed by the green chlorophyll? Well, green, right? Green is going to be reflected, and so when you see a beautiful green tree or blade of grass or whatever, you could say, oh, it's probably chlorophyll in there doing its job, absorbing a lot of colors. We'll see mainly in like the red and the bluish purple types of regions, right? But yeah, the green, no, that's reflected, and that's why we see it when we look at a lot of plants. So light actually behaves as packets of energy. So if you had to quantify this light energy, we call it a photon. All right. So just recapping, which or what color of light is least useful as a driving force for photosynthesis? Green, right? Because most plants are green, and that color is not as useful as other colors would be. All right. So next up, we have to talk about photosystems and how they capture solar power. When pigments absorb photons, their electrons jump to an excited state, and these highly unstable electrons usually fall back down as they lose heat, okay? And they lose other energy as well, for example, light. So when you turn on the light switch for lots of different lights, what you're doing is the electrons are jumping to an excited state, and as they fall back down, they're giving off heat and light, okay? So that's what would happen if you excited chlorophyll. Now, unless you're watching a movie like Avatar or something like that, you know, plants aren't glowing. So they must have some system that when they do absorb energy and jump electrons, there's something there to prevent it from falling back down. That's a photosystem. Okay. All right, and like we said, this is why black becomes so hot on those sunny days. It's absorbing all those wavelengths of light. Some pigments, like chlorophyll, do emit light after heating it up. So if we didn't have a photosystem, if we just took all the chlorophyll out of a plant and put it in a beaker and we shined light on it, look what happens here with this Erlenmeyer flask here. It's actually, oh, it's glowing, it's fluorescing. And that's because you just have chlorophyll. Okay, so again, a plant would kind of waste its time. Why would you spend your time absorbing energy, right, jumping your electrons just to have them fall back down and do really nothing with it? So what a plant needs to do is they have to have a system, a photosystem, a way to harness the energy after that electron jumped. And remember, the farther you get from the nucleus, the more potential energy you have to do work. Okay, and that's what makes it a high energy electron. So sometimes excited electrons will get transferred to other molecules. So pigments and proteins are clustered into photosystems in chloroplasts, and these things are awesome. So as you can see, the green membrane here, okay, just like last chapter, remember the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, the cristae, okay, which line the matrix. Look at this. These green discs, they look like pancakes or something, but they're actually not. They're these folded sacs, okay, and all these folds and stuff allow all this membrane, this thylakoid membrane, okay, to have a whole lot of surface area. And look what's inside of a lot of this membrane are these photosystems. Pretty neat. Okay, so you have something called the reaction center here. Okay, so this is the reaction center complex. And what's going to happen is there's a protein complex that accepts excited electrons. All right, so what's going to happen is you have photon energy coming in here, so light's going to excite chlorophyll. Okay, and the energy gets transferred from one pigment to another until you reach this special pair of chlorophyll A molecules. All right, there's A and B chlorophyll, and what happens is chlorophyll can give up its electron, okay, and allow it to jump up. But because you're in a photosystem, you're not going to allow that electron to fall back down. Okay, you're going to have an electron acceptor up here, and that can then pass on your electron to an electron transport chain, right? Whether it be a big one where you're going to be pumping hydrogen, or a tiny one where you're going to steal it. But point is, you're able to do this. Now, a little foreshadowing here. Why is that electron blue? Think about where it came from. If you're going to jump an electron from chlorophyll, water sits here and gets oxidized, right? So it's really cool. These chlorophyll A molecules are one of the world's strongest oxidizers, because remember, water loves, oxygen's an electronegative bully. So for this guy to be able to rip an electron off of water, ooh, that's a pair of tough guys right there. Okay, pretty neat. So photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 absorb different wavelengths of light while generating ATP and NADPH in the light reactions. And they are named basically when they were discovered. So actually the first one is photosystem 2 and the second one is photosystem 1. But that's what biologists do. We can't go back and rename things. That's crazy. So we just keep their misnames. Which will give off more heat and light, and why? A solution of isolated chlorophyll or intact chloroplast. Now think about what we just talked about. If you're talking about which one's going to give off more heat and more light, it would just be the chlorophyll, right? Because there's nothing to grab the electrons. As the electrons jump up, they fall back down. Whereas intact chloroplast should have photosystems, right? All right, and of course, excited electrons move farther from the nucleus, so they have more, what kind of energy? Potential. Very good, right? So that was a little bit of an intro to photosynthesis, right? So what we've talked about today is some things have to make their own food, right? We're heterotrophs, we eat other things, but plants are autotrophs. So how do they make their own food? Well, they capture sunlight and convert it into sugar. Well, how in the world do they do that? What we learned today is there's two parts to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Photo, the light reactions, right? Here you're absorbing sunlight at your pigments, you're taking in some water, okay, and releasing the oxygen. But what did we get out of the light reactions? We got NADPH and ATP. Now that we're done the photo part, let's do the synthesis part. Synthesis is to make, right? So let's make a sugar. Well, how do we do this? Carbon dioxide comes in from the atmosphere, and we blend in those high energy products of the light reactions, ATP and NADPH, and bam, we get our G3P, we'll see, our glucose eventually, our sugar, right? Pretty cool stuff. So now we're ready to dive in a little bit more. So in the next video, I'm going to assume that you already understand oxidation, reduction. I'm going to understand, you assume that you know electron transport, hydrogen ion or proton motive forces like a gradient being formed, ATP synthase. So you already know all of that stuff. So actually this chapter, pretty simple moving forward. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful for you. Good luck.